Before steel scratched the sky, before the roar of progress drowned everything, there existed a different world. To find the true origins of New York, we must listen to the secrets that lie beneath the asphalt. An echo almost lost in time. This story does not begin with ships and skyscrapers, but with the heartbeat of the earth itself and the first human footprints imprinted on its virgin skin. It is a journey to a world buried beneath our own. A world of wooded hills and crystal-clear streams. More than 12,000 years ago, the great ice mantle that suffocated the continent began its slow retreat. With unimaginable force, the glaciers carved the landscape, opening valleys, depositing hills, and releasing the water that would shape the rivers and the bay we know today. In this newly born, cold and primordial world, the first peoples arrived, the Paleo-Indians. Nomadic hunters who followed the great beasts of the Ice Age, their existence is an enigma barely whispered by stone spear points and fragments of bone. What did they think as they gazed upon this desolate landscape? What stories did they tell around their fires, under a sky free of all artificial light? These are questions that archaeology can barely begin to answer, mysteries kept in the silence of the earth. As millennia passed, the climate softened and forests covered the region. The communities that settled here developed an intimate and complex relationship with this prosperous environment. When history takes a clearer shape, two great cultural groups dominated this territory, the Algonquian-speaking peoples and the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, on the island that would one day be called Manhattan, and in its surroundings lived the Lenape. They were not a unified nation, but a network of communities and clans, such as the Munsee. Their philosophy defined their civilization. The land was not a commodity to be owned, it was a living entity. A mother that provided, and they were its guardians, not its owners. To the north and west, a political structure of astonishing sophistication rose, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or Iroquois, forged. According to their traditions, by the visionary known as the Great Peacemaker, this league united 5 and later 6 nations in a pact of peace. Their great law of peace was an oral constitution that established a delicate balance of power. A structure that would inspire, centuries later, the very founders of the United States. Life in this land, which the Lenape called Lenapehoking, followed the rhythm of the seasons. On the island of Manhattan, the island of many hills, more than 50 streams flowed into the sea, and the biological diversity was extraordinary. The Lenape carefully cultivated the 3 sisters, corn, bean, and squash, in an agricultural symbiosis that nourished both the land and its people. They fished in the rich waters of the bay and hunted in the dense forests. Their paths, trails that wound through the island, would become the ghostly shadows of future avenues such as Broadway. Their villages, with their characteristic longhouses, were centers of community life where traditions were passed down through the spoken word. It was a world woven with rituals and a deep respect for nature. Can we imagine the silence of those nights, only broken by the song of insects, in the very place where today the roar of the city never ceases? The result of these thousands of years was a complex and resilient society, a mosaic of cultures with their own alliances and trades. A world in a delicate balance, vibrant with life. But this balance, forged over countless generations, was about to face a force that operated under completely different rules. A force that did not see the land as a mother, but as a source of wealth, not as a home, but as a frontier to be conquered. As we look at the skyscrapers that today rise over the ancient lands of the Lenape, we confront a profound silence. The complete worldview of a people has been buried beneath layers of concrete and history written by the victors. The legacy of the first inhabitants of New York is not a ruin that can be excavated, but an absence, a question that floats in the air. What was truly lost when these two universes collided? The ocean, which for millennia had only brought tides and storms, held a new secret in its depths. A secret that would soon reveal itself in the form of strange sails on the horizon, marking the end of one world and the violent beginning of another. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The echo of that ancestral, vibrant and autonomous world was about to be interrupted by a sound that had never before traversed these waters, the crackling of European sails propelled by winds of ambition. The 16th century had unleashed a fever for exploration in Europe, a fierce competition among crowns and trading companies to find a new route to the riches of Asia. The Ottoman Empire controlled the land routes, and Portugal dominated the passage through Africa. The Spanish monarchy was expanding across a new continent. For nations like France, England, and the emerging Republic of the Netherlands, the only hope seemed to lie in a chimerical passage through the north. The legendary Northwest Passage. It was this obsession, a mix of geopolitics and greed, that launched ships into the unknown. The first actor in this historical drama was Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine explorer in the service of King Francis I of France. In the year 1524, aboard his caravel, the Dauphin Verrazzano sailed along the Atlantic coast of North America. His decision to anchor in the bay we now know as New York Harbor was almost fortuitous. What he found he described in his letters as a pleasant land, inhabited by people who welcomed him with curiosity from their canoes. He named the region New Angoulême, however his encounter was fleeting. After his departure, a silence of nearly a century fell once again over the bay. What did the Lenape think of that appearance? Was it remembered as an omen, or did it fade into myth? The true turning point would come 85 years later. In the year 1609, an English navigator named Henry Hudson, employed by the powerful Dutch East India Company, arrived with an identical mission to find a water route to Asia. His ship, the Half Main or Half Moon, was an instrument of Dutch corporate ambition. The decisive moment of the journey was when Hudson, instead of limiting himself to the bay, ventured upstream, convinced that the powerful current could be the entrance to the Pacific Ocean. For weeks he sailed northward, delving into territory that no European had mapped. The course of this expedition was a complex ballet of trade and tension. The ship's logs record exchanges. The Lenape and the Mahican offered beaver and otter pelts in exchange for European objects such as metal knives, axes and glass beads. But not everything was peaceful. There were skirmishes and violence. A sailor died from an arrow, and Hudson's crew responded with muskets, leaving a trail of blood in that first encounter. The impact of these contacts was catastrophic, although largely invisible at first. The most devastating legacy did not arrive in the hold of the ships, but in the breath and blood of the explorers. Diseases such as smallpox, measles and influenza found in America a population with no immunity. They spread like an invisible fire, decimating entire communities long before a permanent settlement was established. It was a silent and lethal enemy. At the same time, trade irrevocably altered the local balance of power. Pelts, once a byproduct of hunting, became a commodity of immense value, creating economic dependence and fostering competition and war among tribes. The introduction of firearms exacerbated these conflicts. The seed of an irreversible transformation had been planted, a clash not only of peoples but of cosmologies. And it is here that the great question bequeathed to us by this era resides. The surviving records are almost exclusively European: navigation logs, letters to monarchs, reports to trading companies. They are accounts written from the perspective of profit, filtered through cultural misunderstanding. The voice of the Lenape, their perspective on these strange men who arrived in floating houses, has been largely lost. Whispered only through oral tradition and archaeology, what secrets were lost in the translation of gestures and words, in the abyss between two worlds that observed each other with a mix of wonder and suspicion. The true mystery is not only what occurred, but what was omitted in the ship's logs. Hudson's report did not reveal a route to the spices of the East, but it did uncover the potential for a different kind of wealth, one based on pelts. And it was this promise of profits that would drive the Dutch West India Company to make a momentous decision, to transform a fleeting trading post into a permanent settlement, a city they would call New Amsterdam. That first contact, laden with wonder and suspicion, would soon give way to an era of calculated ambition. The shadow of exploration dissipated to reveal the true engine that would drive the next chapter: trade. In the dawn of the 17th century, the United Provinces of the Netherlands were experiencing their golden age. Transformed into a global maritime and financial power, the Republic projected its influence through formidable corporations. One of them, the newly established Dutch West India Company, set its sights on the promising lands across the Atlantic. Its goal was not glory, but the exploitation of resources. Its primary interest had a name: beaver pelts, a luxury that ignited greed in European markets. The crucial decisions did not emanate from a throne, but from a board of directors in Amsterdam. It was this corporate entity that in the year 1625 made a strategic resolution to establish a permanent settlement at the river that Henry Hudson had explored. They needed a safe harbour, a base to monopolise the lucrative fur trade. The man chosen to execute this vision was Peter Minuit, a pragmatic director of the company. His mission was to consolidate the Dutch presence. Upon arriving at the island that the Lenape called Mannahatta, Minuit immediately understood its potential. Its deep natural harbour and strategic position made it the crown jewel. It was then, in the year 1626, that one of the most famous and enigmatic events in American history took place. According to the records of the company, Peter Minuit negotiated the purchase of Manhattan Island from a group of natives for goods valued at 60 guilders. A tale that has gone down in history as an unprecedented bargain. But within this exchange lies a profound cultural mystery. Did the Lenape understand the European concept of private property and permanent sale of land? Or were they participating in a ritual of hospitality and shared use, believing that the newcomers were merely seeking a temporary place to trade? The transaction, viewed by the Dutch as a legal contract, was likely perceived by the natives as an agreement to share the space, a fundamental misunderstanding whose consequences would resonate for centuries. With the island nominally secured, the Dutch settlers began constructing Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan, the core of the new colony, New Amsterdam. Around it, the streets began to be laid out with the organic logic of trade. The harbour flourished. Company ships arrived laden with settlers and goods and departed filled with furs, tobacco and timber. The colony quickly became a melting pot of nationalities: Walloons, Germans, Scandinavians, Sephardic Jews, and ominously, the first enslaved Africans brought by the company itself to build the infrastructure. This diversity did not arise from an ideal of tolerance, but from the pragmatic need for labour. The impact of this foundation transformed the physical and human landscape forever. The forests of Mannahatta began to fall to make way for farms, or boererijnen, one of which would give its name to the famous Bowery Street. The Lenape, displaced by expansion and decimated by disease, watched as their world faded away. New Amsterdam solidified as a vibrant and chaotic society, defined by the pursuit of profit and a relative freedom. As long as it did not interfere with the interests of the company, it was a place of opportunity and oppression, a microcosm of the emerging Atlantic world. But the legacy of this era leaves us with a troubling question. Could a colony based purely on profit, governed by a distant corporation and populated by a mosaic of people without a unified loyalty, survive the geopolitical pressures of the time? The echo of the 60 guilders resonates as an unanswered question. Was it an act of cunning, of deception, or simply the first chapter of an inevitable conflict? The commercial success of New Amsterdam was its greatest strength and at the same time its Achilles heel. This prosperity, visible from afar, was attracting the envious attention of an imperial rival that considered that entire coast as its own by right. The Dutch flag flew over Fort Amsterdam, but on the horizon the shadow of English ships was already taking shape. That prosperous trading port, born from the ambition of the Dutch West India Company, would soon cast a shadow too large for its rivals. The echo of its success crossed the Atlantic, reaching the ears of an empire that would not tolerate competition. The fate of New Amsterdam was about to be sealed, not in its streets, but in the corridors of power in London. By the middle of the 17th century, the tension between England and the United Provinces of the Netherlands was a powder keg ready to explode. The Anglo-Dutch Wars were a latent conflict for maritime supremacy. In this global chessboard, New Amsterdam represented an anomalous and strategically irritating piece for the English crown. It was a Dutch wedge that geographically divided the British colonies of New England from those in the south. More than a simple division, it was an obstacle to the trade monopoly that England sought to impose through its navigation acts, laws that the merchants of New Amsterdam frequently ignored. It was not a question of whether England would act, but when. The determination that sealed the fate of the colony came directly from the English throne. In March of 1664, King Charles II granted his brother, James, Duke of York, a vast portion of North American territory that conveniently included the entire colony of New Holland. It was a declaration of intent that completely disregarded Dutch sovereignty. To execute this claim, the Duke of York appointed Colonel Richard Nichols and entrusted him with a fleet of 4 frigates. Across the ocean, the Director General of New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant, an authoritarian veteran with a wooden leg, ruled with an iron fist. His loyalty to the company was absolute, but his popularity among the colonists, weary of his taxes and dictatorial style, was dangerously low. By the end of August of 1664, the 4 English frigates anchored in the bay, their cannons aimed directly at the poorly defended Fort Amsterdam. Colonel Nichols did not begin with fire, but with armed diplomacy. He sent a letter to Stuyvesant demanding surrender, but offering surprisingly generous terms in return. Property rights would be respected, freedom of worship, and local customs. Stuyvesant, enraged, tore the letter to pieces, refusing to let the people know the conditions. But rumours of the English offer spread, and a delegation of influential citizens confronted Stuyvesant, demanding that he avoid senseless destruction. The Director General, furiously limping along the walls of the fort, threatened to open fire, but looking around, he saw the harsh reality: a garrison of barely 150 soldiers and a civilian population that had no intention of dying for a trading company. He was alone. On the 8th of September of 1664, without a single shot being fired, Peter Stuyvesant signed the Articles of Capitulation. The Dutch flag was lowered from Fort Amsterdam for the last time, and in its place, the English banner was raised. The direct consequence was a name change that would resonate through history. New Amsterdam was renamed New York in honor of its new owner, the Duke of York. Fort Amsterdam became Fort James. The transition was astonishingly peaceful. True to his word, Nichols allowed life to continue with minimal disruption. The change of hands was less a violent conquest and more an administrative transfer. And here lies the true question of this episode. Why did a fortified city, a vital center of Atlantic trade, surrender without offering the slightest resistance? The answer seems to lie in the very DNA of the city. New Amsterdam was never an ideological crusade. It was, from its conception, a commercial enterprise. Its inhabitants were a cosmopolitan mix united not by loyalty to a flag, but by the pursuit of opportunities. The decision to surrender was not an act of cowardice, but the pragmatic calculation of a community that valued prosperity over patriotism. Was it a betrayal of the Dutch crown, or the first great business decision of a city that would always prioritize trade over loyalty? The mystery of that bloodless surrender is one of a fluid identity. The surrender was not an end, but a metamorphosis. With the English banner flying over the fort, the city, now called New York, was preparing for a new phase of expansion under colonial rule. That change of flag, which sealed the fate of New Amsterdam, was not a mere symbolic act. It was the prologue to a profound transformation. With the Union Jack flying over the fort, the newly renamed New York not only changed its name but also its soul. The Dutch mercantile pragmatism gave way to British imperial ambition, and in that transition, the city began to forge the dual identity that would define it, a beacon of opportunity built on deep contradictions. Under the control of its new owner, James, Duke of York, the colony became an experiment in power. The directives from London sought to consolidate English authority and align the port with the economic interests of the British Empire. The architects of this new era were not just distant monarchs, but the governors sent to impose their will. Men like Richard Nichols and later Edmund Andros faced the task of governing a diverse and stubborn city. Decisive actions were taken in the offices of the governors and in the salons of a new Anglo-Dutch elite. Families such as the Livingstons, the Delanceys, and the Morrises amassed vast tracts of land and controlled trade. One of the most significant determinations was the codification of the Duke's laws in 1665, an attempt to impose the English legal system that, however, had to make concessions to local customs to avoid rebellion. The true engine of colonial growth pulsed in its port. The docks of the East River became a hive of activity. The economy, which under the Dutch had focused on the fur trade, diversified, thanks to laws such as the Bolting Act of 1678, which granted the city the monopoly on flour milling for export. New York became the granary of the Caribbean colonies. But this visible trade concealed a much darker current: active participation in the triangular trade. The city became a crucial nexus in the trafficking of human beings. New York ships transported rum to Africa, exchanging it for enslaved men, women, and children who were sold in the Caribbean or in New York itself. The profits from this inhumane trade financed the construction of the elegant mansions of the elite. Daily life was a tapestry of extreme contrasts. While the merchant class celebrated banquets in the same streets, auctioneers sold people at the Wall Street slave market, officially established in 1711. This tension erupted violently in the slave revolt of 1712 and, even more dramatically, in the so-called conspiracy of 1741. A series of mysterious fires unleashed a wave of panic, which was blamed on enslaved individuals and poor Catholics for an alleged plot. The collective hysteria resulted in brutal repression. Dozens of people, mostly black, were executed after summary trials. The impact of this century of growth was a larger, richer city that was strategically indispensable to the British Empire. Its population multiplied, and its economic influence rivaled that of Boston and Philadelphia. However, this growth left a legacy of structural inequality. Wealth concentrated in a few hands, creating a colonial aristocracy, while the base of that social pyramid was made up of poor workers, hired servants, and an enslaved population that constituted a significant part of the labor force. And here lies the fundamental contradiction of colonial New York. How could a city, which perceived itself as a bastion of freedom and English rights, build its prosperity on the absolute denial of that very freedom? The mystery lies not only in the fires of 1741, but in the psychology of a society that celebrated freedom in its assemblies while selling it in its markets. This fracture in the soul of the city generated an underground current of resentment. The same British economic policies that had enriched the elite began to feel like a noose around the neck for other merchants and artisans. This growing discontent was the slow fuse of a conflict that would soon engulf New York in the flames of revolution. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That growth and prosperity that defined colonial New York carried with it the seed of its own fracture. The loyalties forged during a century of English rule were about to be put to the test. In the taverns and docks of Manhattan, the proclamations of the British Parliament resonated no longer as the voice of a mother country, but as the clanking of chains. The Stamp Act and the taxes on tea were not mere economic disputes. They were cracks in the foundations of an empire. And New York, with its vital port and divided population, found itself right over the fault line. The Sons of Liberty faced off against the Loyalists, and the statue of King George III in Bowling Green became a symbol of unsustainable tension. Could a city so tied to the British Crown harbour the heart of a rebellion? The enigma of its loyalty hung in the air. The determination that would seal the city's fate was made by two men on opposing sides. On one side, General George Washington, at the head of an emerging Continental Army, made a bold decision to defend New York at all costs. He understood its symbolic and strategic value, but defending an island against the most powerful navy in the world was a deadly trap. On the other side of the Atlantic, the government of King George III tasked the Howe brothers, General William and Admiral Richard, with a clear mission to crush the rebellion starting with its most contentious nest. Their plan was to deploy a force of such magnitude that the mere sight of it would break the will of the colonists. The summer of 1776 brought the answer. Hundreds of warships and British transports appeared on the horizon, filling the port of New York. For New Yorkers, it was an overwhelming display of power. War had arrived. By the end of August, General Howe's forces landed on Long Island, in present-day Brooklyn. The British plan was of lethal cunning. While part of their army launched a frontal attack, a much larger force, guided by local sympathizers, executed a devastating flanking maneuver. At dawn on the 27th of August, the Continental Army found itself trapped. The Battle of Long Island became a massacre. The inexperienced American soldiers, gripped by panic, fled, being hunted down in the woods and marshes. The defeat was total, with the army shattered and trapped against the East River. The end of the revolution seemed imminent, but here, history takes a legendary turn. On the night of the 29th of August, under a cloak of darkness, Washington ordered an impossible evacuation. Fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts, manning rowboats, began to cross the river again and again, transporting more than 9,000 men, their horses and cannons right under the noses of the British Navy. Fate seemed to intervene when at dawn a thick fog descended over the area, concealing the final stages of the retreat. Shortly thereafter, Manhattan fell, and with the British occupation came another mystery. A great fire that on the 21st of September consumed nearly a quarter of the city. Was it an accident, an act of patriotic sabotage, or a tactic of the British? The ashes held no answer. The impact of these events transformed New York into a shadow of itself. It became the headquarters of British power in North America and a vast prison. For the Loyalists, it was a refuge. For the Patriots, a hell. Thousands of prisoners of war were crammed into the infamous prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay, where diseases and starvation claimed more lives than many battles. The city, which had been a melting pot of growth, became a symbol of suffering and imperial control for 7 long years. However, amid the devastation, a fundamental question persisted. How could this city, the epicenter of British power and the scene of the most humiliating defeat for the rebels, not only survive but rise from its ruins to play a central role in the nation it helped to birth? Its role in the war had ended, but its destiny in the forging of the new nation was just beginning. The ashes of war were still warm on the streets of New York when the British troops finally departed, leaving a city marked by occupation, yet liberated. However, the spectre of uncertainty loomed over it. Military victory did not guarantee a nation. United under the fragile Articles of Confederation, the colonies were more an unstable alliance than a country. The war debt was suffocating and trade was paralyzed. In this crisis atmosphere, New York, with its strategic port and devastated economy, became a microcosm of the enigma facing the entire nation: how to forge a lasting union from discord. At the heart of this debate emerged two irreconcilable visions, embodied by two of the most powerful men in New York. On one side stood Governor George Clinton, a popular politician fervently defending state sovereignty. For Clinton and his followers, the anti-federalists, a strong central authority was a threat, a ghost of monarchical power. On the opposite side rose the figure of Alexander Hamilton. A New Yorker by adoption, Hamilton had witnessed the ineffectiveness of the Continental Congress. His vision was of a unified nation with a robust federal government. For him, the survival of the Republic depended on the creation of a new and bold constitution, a decision that would pit him directly against Clinton's powerful political apparatus. The climax of this ideological battle was fought at a tense ratification convention in Poughkeepsie during the summer of 1788. The New York delegation was overwhelmingly dominated by Clinton's anti-federalists. However, Hamilton, alongside John Jay and James Madison, had already unleashed his most powerful weapon, a series of essays published in New York newspapers, known today as Asterisk, the Federalist Papers Asterisk. They were a brilliant defense of the new Constitution. In Poughkeepsie, Hamilton deployed a strategy of delay and persuasion. For weeks, the debates were fierce. The turning point came not from an argument, but from news. A messenger brought word that New Hampshire and then Virginia had ratified the Constitution, making it the law of the land. New York faced catastrophic isolation. Under this unbearable pressure, the anti-federalists' resistance crumbled. By a narrow margin, New York ratified the Constitution. The consequences were immediate and transformative. As recognition of its importance, New York City was named the first temporary capital of the United States of America. Overnight, the city became the epicenter of power. The old City Hall was remodeled and renamed Federal Hall. It was from its balcony on Wall Street that on the 30th of April in 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president. For just over a year, New York was a hotbed of political activity, where the first government departments were created and the financial foundations of the nation were laid under Hamilton's direction. But this moment of glory would be fleeting, and here lies the central question of this chapter. Why did New York, after having been such a crucial stage, lose its status as capital so quickly? The answer lies in the shadows of a political deal. The Compromise of 1790. In a private dinner, Alexander Hamilton negotiated with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. In exchange for Southern support for his financial plan, which centralized state debt, Hamilton agreed to move the capital, first temporarily to Philadelphia and then permanently to a new federal district on the banks of the Potomac River. New York was sacrificed on the altar of political compromise. Was this loss a failure or the secret to its future success? Stripped of its political crown, the city was forced to double down on its true vocation. One that did not reside in government but in the docks, banks and markets. Deprived of the title of political capital, New York would not lament. Instead, it would forge a new identity based on trade, capital and ambition. The stage was set for a new explosion of people and opportunities. The echo of its brief reign as the capital had barely faded when New York, stripped of its political power, found itself at a crossroads. Its destiny would no longer be forged in the halls of government, but in the waters of its harbour and on its streets. The 19th century opened like a blank book, and on its pages, the city would write a chapter of transformation as violent as it was miraculous. The mercantile pragmatism of its elites flourished without restrictions. The young American Republic looked westward, but the great obstacle was the Appalachian Mountains. How to connect the agricultural heart of the nation with the Atlantic markets? The answer to this question would define the future of New York. It was in this context that Governor DeWitt Clinton pursued a vision that many considered madness, an artificial canal of nearly 600 kilometers that would connect the Hudson River with Lake Erie. Meanwhile, on the island of Manhattan itself, another monumental decision was being made. In the year 1811, the commission led by Gouverneur Morris presented a radical plan, ignoring the natural topography of the island. They imposed upon it a cold grid of streets and avenues. It was a declaration of intent. Nature would submit to the logic of commerce. These two determinations, that of the canal and that of the grid, were calculated bets by an elite determined to turn their city into the economic engine of the New World. Events accelerated. In the year 1825, the Erie Canal was inaugurated with a ceremony known as the Wedding of the Waters, in which DeWitt Clinton poured a barrel of water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean. The effect was instantaneous. The cost of transporting goods from the Midwest plummeted by 95%. Overnight, New York became the undisputed gateway for entry and exit in America. Grain, timber, and resources from the interior flooded its docks. At the same time, the grid began its relentless advance northward, erasing the original landscape of Manhattan from the map. But this economic explosion needed human fuel. Fleeing the Great Famine in Ireland and political turmoil in Germany, millions of immigrants saw in New York the promise of a new beginning. They disembarked at Castle Garden with little more than the clothes on their backs. The immediate impact transformed the city into a place of brutal extremes. The population skyrocketed, rising from barely 60,000 inhabitants in the year 1800 to over 1 million by the year 1870. New York became a laboratory of modern life, but beneath the surface of opportunity, shadows of desperation were brewing. To house the new labor force, tenements emerged, overcrowded apartment buildings with no ventilation or sanitation, where diseases spread. Streets like those in the Five Points neighborhood became synonymous with misery and crime, a dark counterpoint to the growing power of Wall Street bankers. Political machines like Tammany Hall, under the control of figures like William Boss Tweed, found in the masses of immigrants a power base, exchanging basic services and jobs for votes, weaving a web of corruption that infiltrated every stratum of the city. And here lies the fundamental contradiction of this century of expansion. New York had risen as the symbol of the American dream, a place where fortune could be forged through hard work. It had tamed geography with its canal and its grid, but at what cost? Was this the triumph of human will, or the creation of a new type of urban monster that devoured its most vulnerable children to feed its insatiable growth? The legacy of this era is a duality that still defines the soul of the city, the promise of unlimited ascent and the reality of an abysmal fall, coexisting on the same streets. As the fortunes of a few soared, built on the foundations of this new metropolis, in its shadows grew a very different reality, a story of unbridled opulence and hidden misery that would define the next era. The Gilded Age. That torrent of expansion that flooded New York in the 19th century quickly forged a city of two faces. The echo of the Civil War faded, and in its place, an industrial and financial fever seized the nation. With New York as its epicenter, an era of opulence began, so unrestrained that the writer Mark Twain would sarcastically name it the Gilded Age, suggesting a thin layer of gold that barely concealed the underlying decay. Capital, freed from regulations, flowed unbridled, raising empires overnight and creating an illusion of unlimited progress. The architects of this new era were men whose names would become legend: the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. Cornelius Vanderbilt consolidated a vast empire of railroads and steamboats. His decision to build the Grand Central Depot was not merely an infrastructure project, it was a declaration of power. In its shadow, Andrew Carnegie erected a colossus of steel, while John D. Rockefeller controlled the flow of energy. These magnates operated under a philosophy of relentless competition. However, in the political sphere, power did not emanate from the mansions of Fifth Avenue, but from the taverns controlled by Tammany Hall. Under the leadership of William Boss Tweed, this political machine perfected a system of corruption, offering jobs and assistance to immigrants in exchange for their electoral loyalty, while siphoning millions of dollars from the public coffers. Tweed's actions, such as the inflated construction of the county courthouse, were a dark reflection of those of the magnates. The use of power for personal enrichment. The events of the time painted a canvas of brutal contrasts. On Fifth Avenue, dubbed Millionaire's Row, marble palaces rose, replicas of European castles where extravagant balls were held. The Astor and Vanderbilt families competed in a race of opulence. Fortunes were built that defied imagination, financing operas, museums, and universities that still define the cultural landscape of New York today. But just a few miles away, in the overcrowded tenements of the Lower East Side, a parallel reality unfolded. In dark, unventilated buildings, Entire families crowded into a single room, struggling against tuberculosis and despair. The photographer and social reformer Jacob Riis, with his pioneering work How the Other Half Lives, dragged this dark truth into the light, revealing child labor in sweatshops and a poverty so deep that it seemed incurable. The immediate effect of this extreme polarization was a social tension on the verge of explosion. The discontent of the working class channeled into the formation of unions and a wave of strikes that were often suppressed with violence. The city became a battleground of ideology, where the ideas of socialism and anarchism found fertile ground. At the same time, excess and corruption provoked a backlash. A brave journalistic campaign by the New York Times exposed Boss Tweed's network of bribes, leading to his downfall and imprisonment in 1871. It was a small victory, a crack in the gilded facade. The legacy of this era was, therefore, a monumental infrastructure built on a foundation of exploitation and systemic inequality. The true mystery of the Gilded Age, however, does not reside in the magnitude of its fortunes, but in the chasm that separated them from misery. Was this the inevitable price of progress, the dark sacrifice on the altar of modernity? Or was it the legacy of a system designed by a few for their own benefit, a shadow that the city still struggles to dispel? The question resonates in the facades of the ancient palaces and in the silence of forgotten alleys. And as the city grappled with this contradiction, a monumental gift crossed the Atlantic, a promise of copper and steel destined to rise in the heart of its harbour. Its torch would be raised not over the palaces of Fifth Avenue, but facing the millions who arrived seeking a dream, the arrival of the Statue of Liberty. In the shadows of the opulence and misery that defined the Gilded Age, an echo of past revolutions began to take shape across the Atlantic. It was not a business plan, but an idea, a monumental gesture born in the heart of the Third French Republic. A government seeking to reaffirm the ideals of liberty. The historian and politician Édouard de Laboulaye, a fervent admirer of the American system, conceived a gift to commemorate the centenary of American independence and celebrate the alliance between the two nations. It was a bold vision, a colossus that would embody liberty illuminating the world. Laboulaye's initiative set in motion an unprecedented machinery of art and engineering. The sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi was chosen to shape this vision. He travelled to America and upon entering the port of New York found the perfect location, Bedloe Island, a small piece of land that every ship had to pass upon arrival. His design was laden with meticulous symbolism. The crown with 7 spikes representing the 7 continents and seas, the tablet in her left hand inscribed with the date of the Declaration of Independence, and at her feet a broken chain, a powerful symbol of the abolition of slavery. But how could a structure of such magnitude stand tall? The answer to this technical enigma came from the mind of Gustave Eiffel. His design of a wrought iron internal skeleton, a flexible and independent structure from the copper skin, was an engineering feat that would allow the statue to adapt to temperature changes. The development of the project became a transatlantic spectacle. In France, citizens donated funds for the construction of the statue. In 1885, once completed, it was disassembled into more than 350 pieces, packed into 214 boxes, and embarked on the French frigate Isère for its journey across the ocean. But upon arriving in New York, it faced an unexpected obstacle: indifference. The Congress of the United States and the elites of New York had been reluctant to finance the construction of the pedestal. The project stalled. It was then that a new actor entered the scene, Joseph Pulitzer, the editor of the newspaper **The New York World**. In an action that would change the fate of the monument, Pulitzer launched an unprecedented fundraising campaign. Not directed at the wealthy, but at ordinary people, he appealed to the pride of immigrants and the working class, publishing the name of every donor. His campaign was a resounding success, transforming the pedestal into a monument built literally by the people. The impact of its arrival in October of 1886 was profound. The Statue of Liberty instantly became the symbol of the city. But its meaning quickly transcended the original intention. For the millions of immigrants who began to arrive in droves, their first vision of America was not the land, but her. She became the mother of exiles, as immortalized by the poet Emma Lazarus in her sonnet The New Colossus, whose lines would be inscribed on her base years later. It was the promise of a new beginning, a beacon of hope. The statue, a gift from one government to another, was reappropriated by popular imagination, becoming the most powerful symbol of the American dream. However, here lies the central question that her legacy poses to us. While the Lady of Liberty raised her torch, the city at her feet remained a place of brutal inequalities. Could a monument, no matter how grand, reconcile the promise of liberty with the harsh reality of exploitative workshops, discrimination, and the misery that awaited many? The statue promised a golden door, but for countless souls, that door led to an unrelenting struggle for survival. This new and vast human contingent, drawn by her silent promise, would become the engine of an unprecedented transformation, propelling New York into the heart of a new century. That beacon of hope, promised by the Lady of Liberty, not only attracted millions of souls, it ignited the fuse of a dizzying transformation. As the threshold of the 20th century was crossed, New York was no longer a mere port city. It had become a living, convulsing, and hungry organism whose pulse began to set the rhythm of the world. The echo of the Gilded Age still resonated, but in the streets a new murmur, that of modernity, was turning into a roar. Politically, the city itself had mutated. The determination made in 1998 by the state legislature to consolidate the 5 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, into a single megalopolis was not a mere administrative act. It was the creation of an urban empire. The reins of this newly born giant were in the hands of men with ambitions as vast as the city itself. The political machinery of Tammany Hall, despite its corruption, was an unavoidable player, deciding where bridges and tunnels would be built. At the same time, in the offices of Wall Street, financiers like J.P. Morgan were turning the city into the center of gravity of global capitalism. The most significant decision of the era was not made in a boardroom, but underground. It was visionaries like August Belmont Jr., at the helm of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, who understood that for the city not to implode, it had to expand through underground veins. On the 27th of October in 1904, the earth trembled. The first subway train in New York began its journey, connecting parts of the city that until then seemed like distant worlds. It was not just an advancement in transportation, it was a social and spatial revolution. This circulatory system of steel allowed the workforce to disperse and enabled Manhattan to consolidate as a purely commercial hub. The geography of daily life was completely rewritten. As the tunnels opened beneath their feet, the surface became a cultural melting pot. In the cafes of Greenwich Village, artists and writers began to challenge conventions, forging the bohemian spirit. In the theaters of Broadway and in the publishing houses of Tin Pan Alley, an industry of mass entertainment was born that would export New York culture to every corner of the planet. New York was not only manufacturing steel and finance, it was now producing dreams en masse. The direct effects of this feverish modernization were a living paradox. On one hand, there was unprecedented prosperity and a creative energy that attracted the brightest talent from around the world. The city became a magnet for capital and innovation. On the other hand, the shadow of this modernity loomed over the overcrowded tenements of the Lower East Side, where living conditions often belied the promise of the statue that had welcomed them. Exponential growth brought with it social tensions and an ever-deepening chasm between dazzling opulence and anonymous misery. The city was both a beacon and an abyss, and here lies the great unknown of this chapter in New York's history, with a population that doubled every few decades and an economic power that seemed to know no bounds. The metropolis faced an existential mystery: how to continue growing when horizontal space had run out. The island of Manhattan, the epicenter of all this power, was finite. The soul of the city demanded a new dimension to expand, a new territory to conquer. The echo of that question would not resonate in the valleys or in the rivers, but in an unexpected direction, towards the sky. A new class of ambition was about to give its bold answer, sketching on the horizon a silhouette that the world had never seen before. That transformation of New York into the epicenter of the modern world demanded a physical manifestation, a declaration of power etched in stone and steel. As the 20th century progressed, modernization ceased to be an economic concept and became a vertical ambition, a race towards the clouds that would leave an indelible mark. The echo of the Gilded Age still resonated, but now opulence would not be measured in horizontal mansions, but in the audacity of building towards infinity. The context of the early 20th century was a mix of prosperity and an almost blind faith in technological progress. The city of New York, confined to the island of Manhattan, faced a spatial enigma. How to grow when land is finite? The answer came from engineers and architects. The invention of the steel frame and the refinement of the safety elevator by Alicia Otis were the keys that opened the door to a new urban dimension. The society of the time, driven by financial speculation, demanded office spaces that were symbols of its power. The ground of Manhattan became the most expensive chessboard in the world, and the only winning move was to build upwards. In this scenario of unbridled ambition, decisions were not made by government committees, but by titans of industry. Men like Frank Woolworth did not just want a headquarters for his empire, he wanted a cathedral. His decision to commission architect Cass Gilbert to construct the Woolworth Building in 1913 was not a mere business act, but a challenge to the sky. Later, in the late 20s, rivalry was personified in two figures: Walter Chrysler, the automobile giant, and John J. Raskob, an executive of General Motors. The struggle between the Chrysler Building and the Manhattan Bank Building at 40 Wall Street became a public obsession. William Van Allen, architect of Chrysler, and H. Craig Severance, architect of 40 Wall Street, engaged in a personal battle for the title of the tallest building in the world. The events became a symphony of rivets and cranes that resonated day and night throughout Manhattan. First, the Woolworth Building rose like a Gothic castle, earning the nickname the Cathedral of Commerce and boasting the height record. But it was the race of the late 20s that captured the world's imagination. As 40 Wall Street added floors, Van Allen kept a secret. Inside the frame of the Chrysler Building, a 38-meter stainless steel spire was secretly assembled. In an architectural coup, the spire was hoisted and secured in place within hours, surpassing its rival. However, its reign would be short-lived. John J. Raskob, wounded in his pride, pushed for an even bolder project, the Empire State Building. Conceived with astonishing speed, its steel skeleton grew at a rate of 4.5 floors per week. Thousands of workers, many of them immigrants and Mohawk natives known as skyboys, worked hundreds of meters high with barely any safety measures. The immediate impact of this boom was profound and contradictory. Economically, massive construction generated thousands of jobs and solidified Midtown and Lower Manhattan as the most important business districts on the planet. The skyline of New York transformed into an iconic electrocardiogram of peaks and spires, a universal symbol of ambition and American capitalism. Culturally, it changed the relationship between humans and the city, offering divine perspectives from its observatories. But at what cost was this glory achieved? The shadows of these towers concealed dangerous working conditions and a growing social gap. And here lies the fundamental contradiction of this era. In observing these structures, we face a dual legacy. The true mystery lies not in the engineering that supports them, but in the spirit that drove them. Was it the culmination of a dream of unlimited progress? Or was it the echo of unchecked pride, a modern Tower of Babel built on the edge of an economic precipice that no one, in their feverish race towards the sky, seemed to see? The spires that pierced the clouds were monuments to prosperity, but also, unknowingly, tombstones of an era that was about to end. This colossus, The Empire State Building was inaugurated not with the roar of triumph, but with the unsettling silence of a city peering into the abyss of the Great Depression. That dizzying ascent of steel and ambition cast an ever-lengthening shadow. It was the shadow of an economic mirage built on foundations of speculation. In the streets, a feverish euphoria seized the city, while Wall Street became the epicenter of a financial frenzy that seemed endless. The overflowing optimism of the 1920s, fueled by easy credit, had inflated a colossal bubble. The question was not whether the bubble would burst, but how devastating the fall would be for the city that believed itself invincible. On the 24th of October in 1929, Black Thursday, the mirage shattered. Panic gripped the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, triggering a massive sell-off that evaporated fortunes in hours. The initial response of President Herbert Hoover, anchored in a philosophy of non-intervention, proved insufficient. In New York, Mayor James "Jimmy" Walker, a charismatic figure but embroiled in corruption scandals, seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe. It was then that two figures emerged as the architects of an uncertain recovery: Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected president in 1932 with the promise of a New Deal, and Fiorello LaGuardia, a tireless reformer who became mayor of New York in 1934. Their actions, in an unprecedented alliance between federal and municipal power, would change the face of the city. Alongside them, a controversial figure, Robert Moses, the master builder, saw in the crisis an opportunity to redesign New York. The sequence of events was brutal. By 1932, 1 in 4 New Yorkers was unemployed. The famous bread lines stretched for entire blocks. In parks like Central Park, improvised camps known as Hoovervilles emerged, shantytown cities built from boxes and scrap. The opulence of Fifth Avenue became a surreal backdrop to widespread misery. But with the arrival of LaGuardia and the New Deal funds from Roosevelt, a titanic transformation began. Through programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration, the federal government injected billions of dollars into the city. LaGuardia's energy channeled these funds into projects that redefined urban infrastructure. Under the controversial direction of Robert Moses, iconic bridges like the Triborough were erected, tunnels like the Lincoln were excavated, and hundreds of parks and public pools were created. The result was a duality of progress and scars. Physically, New York emerged from the Depression with modernized infrastructure. Politically, the power of the corrupt Tammany Hall machine was broken. Socially, a new contract was forged: the idea that the government had the responsibility to protect its citizens. However, the legacy was not one-dimensional. The city that rose was stronger, but also more divided. The grand works of Robert Moses were often built at the expense of poor neighborhoods and minorities, whose communities were razed to make way for highways, sowing seeds of resentment and inequality. And here lies the central question of this era. The recovery of New York was an undeniable triumph of human will. But at what cost was this new New York built? Was the recovery an act of salvation for all? Or was it also an act of social reconfiguration that consolidated new forms of exclusion? The hidden legacy of the Great Depression is not just the story of overcoming an economic crisis, but the mystery of how the solutions to that crisis reshaped the social fabric of the city, leaving a complex and often painful imprint. The newly risen city did not know that its new infrastructure was about to be tested in a conflict of global scale. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The recovery efforts, born out of necessity during the Great Depression, would soon be transformed by a conflict of unimaginable scale. As Europe plunged into darkness, the echoes of the impending war reached the shores of New York like the harbinger of a storm. The atmosphere prior to the entry of the United States into the Second World War was a riddle in itself. In the streets of Manhattan, the tensions of the old world manifested in contradictory ways. The German-American Bund, sympathetic to Nazism, gathered more than 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden in 1939. Yet the majority of New Yorkers watched with growing alarm as tyranny spread across Europe. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December in 1941 was not a beginning, but the detonation that released contained energy, turning anxiety into action and New York into the epicenter of the war effort. The determinations that sealed the city's fate were made at the highest levels. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a true New Yorker, understood the strategic power of the city. Under his orders, and with the energetic management of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, New York transformed into a logistical fortress. LaGuardia organized civil defense, oversaw blackout drills, and mobilized the population, but the most crucial decision was the militarization of its port. The United States Army designated the Port of New York as the primary embarkation port, a logistical action that would make it the gateway in and out for the war in Europe. Corporations and industrial magnates reconfigured their production lines to manufacture the tools of war. What followed was one of the fastest transformations in urban history. The Port of New York became a heart of steel and steam, relentlessly pumping men and material to the front. More than 3 million soldiers and 37 million tons of supplies would pass through its docks. Troop ships, painted in a ghostly grey, set sail in the stillness of the night. The Brooklyn Navy Yard became a colossal war factory operating 24 hours a day. Legendary battleships like the USS Missouri were launched from its ways. Thousands of women, the Rosie the Riveters of New York, filled the positions of the men who had left. But beneath this surface of patriotic unity lurked the shadows of suspicion. The fear of sabotage was palpable, especially after the mysterious fire that sank the French transatlantic liner Normandy. This enigma led authorities to forge a secret pact with the imprisoned mafia boss, Lucky Luciano, to ensure that his men guaranteed the security of the docks. The impact of the war on New York was profound and lasting. By the end of the conflict, the city had emerged more powerful than ever. Its economy, driven by war production, was booming. The war solidified its status as a global financial and political capital, home to the nascent United Nations. But this triumph came at a cost. The golden stars hung in the windows were a silent reminder of those who would never return. The city had become a military and economic giant, but its soul bore the scars of loss and the weight of a new global consciousness. And here lies the fundamental question of this chapter. The war forged an unprecedented image of unity. New Yorkers of all backgrounds worked side by side. But was this unity a genuine social transformation or merely a temporary truce dictated by necessity? The war effort masked the racial and social tensions that had defined the city, but did not eliminate them. What hidden legacies did this massive mobilization leave in the social fabric as the roar of the war machine began to fade? A different echo, more rhythmic and syncopated, began to resonate with new strength from the city's clubs, the explosion of jazz and the Harlem Renaissance. As the machinery of war fell silent in the shipyards of New York, a different, older and vibrant echo was rising in the streets of the city. It was not the roar of industry, but the syncopated pulse of a drum, the improvisation of a saxophone. A cultural energy contained for decades was about to explode, not on Fifth Avenue, but in the heart of a neighborhood north of Manhattan, Harlem. The context that prepared this stage is a chapter in itself. The Great Migration, a massive exodus of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North, had transformed the demographics of cities like New York. Fleeing the oppression of Jim Crow laws, they found in Harlem a place to put down roots. However, this new home was fenced in by segregation. It was in this crucible of hope and confinement that a yearning emerged, the desire to forge a new and proud identity. Prohibition, imposed in 1920, added a layer of secrecy to nightlife, creating the famous speakeasies, illegal clubs where social barriers, including racial ones, often became porous. In this charged atmosphere, the actions of a group of key figures became the catalyst for change. They were not politicians, but intellectuals, artists, and musicians. Figures like the sociologist Webb Du Bois promoted the idea of the talented 10th, an African-American intellectual elite whose art would demonstrate the futility of racism. The philosopher Alain Locke, in his influential anthology The New Anthology, gave name and expression to the movement. The initiatives of these leaders were not decrees but a call to creation, to which poets like Langston Hughes responded, capturing the rhythm and blues of the black soul, and novelists like Zora Neale Hurston. The sequence of events was a multisensory explosion. Sound was its vanguard. In legendary clubs like the Savoy Ballroom and Small's Paradise, musicians like Duke Ellington leading his orchestra in the controversial Cotton Club, and the trumpeter Louis Armstrong deconstructed ragtime and blues to create something radically new, jazz. It was a language of improvisation and freedom that became the soundtrack of the era. The nights of Harlem were filled with rent parties, apartment parties to help pay the rent, and with crowds, both white and black, flocking to the clubs. The theatres of the neighbourhood, like the Lafayette, showcased works by black playwrights with black actors. Visual artists like Aaron Douglas painted murals that fused African aesthetics with modernism. Harlem had become a cultural capital. The immediate effects of this effervescence were profound and contradictory. On one hand, the Harlem Renaissance catapulted African American culture to the center of the national conversation. Jazz became the first genuinely American musical genre to conquer the world. An undeniable sense of pride and community was forged. However, the shadow of exploitation loomed. Many of the most famous clubs, like the Cotton Club, were owned by white gangsters and maintained a strict policy of segregation. Was this interest a form of genuine appreciation or a type of exotic voyeurism? Cultural prosperity did not always translate into economic prosperity for most residents of Harlem. And it is here that the central paradox of this golden era resides. Was the Harlem Renaissance a true cultural revolution that empowered its people, or was it a shiny bubble, a cultural product consumed by a fascinated white America that left the structures of inequality intact? The legacy is a double-edged mystery, a celebration of creativity and resilience, and at the same time a reminder that cultural visibility does not necessarily equate to social justice. The jazz notes that floated over Harlem were a song of freedom, but also a lament for a promise still unfulfilled. This vibrant yet complex cultural awakening had sown a spirit of self-affirmation that would remain latent, transforming into the roots of a much more direct and political struggle in the turbulent 60s. As the notes of jazz and the echo of Harlem Renaissance poetry still resonated, a new melody, more dissonant and urgent, began to take shape in its streets. The promise of equality now faced the harsh reality of a city that, beneath its cosmopolitan surface, concealed deep cracks of injustice. The decade of 1960 would not be one of celebration, but of confrontation. The historical context was a paradox. On one hand, the administration of Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. continued with massive modernization projects, a legacy of the era of Robert Moses, which often involved the demolition of entire neighborhoods, displacing low-income communities. Nationally, the civil rights movement was gaining unstoppable momentum in the South. Could New York, the self-proclaimed beacon of freedom, remain oblivious to that call? The answer lay latent in the neighborhoods of Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the South Bronx, where discrimination in housing, employment, and police brutality was an open wound. The actors in this urban drama were not monarchs, but a new breed of leaders emerging from popular discontent. In Harlem, the voice of Malcolm X, charismatic and defiant, articulated the frustration and anger of those who felt that the American promise had been denied to them. His speeches called for self-affirmation and resistance. In the political sphere, Mayor John Lindsay, elected in 1965, represented a new generation of liberal leaders. His decision to walk through the most troubled neighborhoods during the riots was an unprecedented symbolic gesture. But was it enough to calm a storm that had been brewing for decades? Crucial determinations were no longer made solely in City Hall, but in community assemblies and on the streets. The sequence of events was a seismic escalation. The decade began with sit-ins and pickets against discrimination, but the tension reached its boiling point in the summer of 1964, following an incident in which a police officer killed a 15-year-old African-American boy. Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant erupted into several days of riots. It was the first major racial uprising of the decade in the North. The assassination of Malcolm X in 1965 left a void and a legacy of martyrdom that radicalized many. As the decade progressed, the focus of discontent widened. The Vietnam War became a catalyst for a generation of youth. In 1968, Columbia University became the epicenter of student unrest. The administration's decision to build a gymnasium in Morningside Park, with a separate entrance for the Harlem community, was the spark. Students led by figures like Mark Rudd occupied several campus buildings. The city's response was force, a massive police intervention that left hundreds injured, and just when the decade seemed to be coming to an end, a new front opened. In the early hours of June 28th, 1969, a police raid at the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in Greenwich Village, met with unprecedented resistance. Patrons, fed up with years of harassment, fought back. The Stonewall Uprising was the explosive birth of the modern movement for gay rights. The immediate result was a deep polarization of the city. For some, the protests were proof of a society crumbling. For others, they were the painful births of a more just order. The city was marked by a palpable distrust between communities and law enforcement. Politically, these movements forced the creation of civilian review boards for the police and the passage of anti-discrimination laws. The Pandora's box of political identity had been opened, but here lies the enigma of the chapter. Did these voices, arising from the asphalt and fury, truly manage to rewrite the genetic code of New York? Or was their echo absorbed by the very structures of power they sought to dismantle, leaving a legacy of change more symbolic than real? The mystery of the 60s is not what was shouted in the streets, but how much of that shout truly penetrated the foundations of the city, as the city grappled with the scars of its social fracture. A completely different, silent and economic shadow began to stretch over its finances, a cost that would bring New York to the very brink of the abyss. From the ashes of the social upheaval of the 1960s, the promised utopia did not emerge, but rather the ominous echo of a different siren, that of financial collapse. The vibrant pulse of New York was beginning to falter. The city, which had stood as a monument to power, now found itself on the brink of an abyss. The post-war optimism had evaporated, leaving a legacy of monumental debts, the so-called urban disinvestment. Accelerated by the exodus of the middle class to the suburbs and the decline of the manufacturing base, had left entire neighborhoods in a state of abandonment. The administration of Mayor John Lindsay, with its ambitious and costly social programs, had attempted to stem the tide, but its efforts only deepened the fiscal hole. In this scenario of decay, the key figures were not revolutionaries, but accountants and politicians. Mayor Abraham Beame inherited in 1974 a city in critical condition. He discovered that his predecessors had been financing the budget with short-term debt, a ticking time bomb of accounting. When the banks refused to continue lending money, the detonation was imminent. The crucial decision then fell to President Gerald Ford. In a speech that would go down in infamy, Ford denied federal assistance. A refusal that the headline of the New York Daily News summarized in a pithy phrase, "Ford to city, drop dead." Would the federal government allow its most iconic city to declare bankruptcy? The autumn of 1975 became a chronicle of despair. The city was hours away from bankruptcy. It was then that an unexpected figure emerged, investment banker Felix Rohatyn. Through a complex maneuver, Rohatyn orchestrated the creation of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or MAC. This new entity, controlled by the state, was given the power to sell bonds on behalf of the city. In exchange, the city had to accept the establishment of an emergency financial control board, an unelected committee with veto power over the municipal budget. New York had been saved, but at a terrible price, the surrender of a part of its democratic sovereignty. The crisis was not just fiscal. It was existential. The blackout of 1977, which plunged the city into darkness and unleashed a wave of looting, became the definitive symbol of this dark era. The Bronx was burning. The subway was a lawless territory, and Times Square had transformed into a sordid bazaar of vice. The immediate impact of the crisis was a decade of brutal austerity. Under the watchful eye of the Control Board, the city drastically cut public services. However, from these harsh measures began to emerge slowly a new type of city. The arrival of Mayor Ed Koch in 1978 marked a change in tone. His pragmatism and defiant optimism resonated in a city hungry for good news. Simultaneously, federal financial deregulation unleashed a new era of prosperity on Wall Street. The boom of the 80s began to fill the city's coffers with new tax revenues. The glass and steel skyscrapers rose again. New York was reborn, but it was a different city, tougher, more corporate. And here lies the central question of this dark and transformative chapter. The Renaissance of New York was undeniable, but was it a true resurrection for all? Or the triumph of one economic model over another? The city was saved by a Faustian pact with financial capital. This rescue laid the foundations for the global and wealthy metropolis we know today, but it also deepened inequalities. The lingering question is whether the soul of the city was part of the price of its salvation. While Wall Street celebrated, a different energy began to take shape in the lofts and clubs of downtown, setting the stage for the innovation era of the 1990s. That urban renaissance of the 1980s, forged in the harshness of the fiscal crisis, was only the prelude to a deeper metamorphosis. The echoes of decay still resonated, but a new energy, silent and digital, began to pulse beneath the asphalt. The city, after decades of struggling against its own ghosts, was preparing for a quantum leap, one that would not be built with steel, but with fiber optics and binary code. New York was about to reinvent itself once again. The context of the late 20th century presented a unique canvas. With the end of the Cold War, a globalist optimism permeated culture. Crime, which had defined the perception of New York for nearly 30 years, remained the most persistent shadow. The administration of Mayor David Dinkins had made progress, but the sense of insecurity lingered. It was in this environment, a mix of hope and fear, where the seed of a radical transformation would germinate. Two key figures and their actions would mark the fate of the decade. In 1994, Rudolph Giuliani took office as mayor with an unwavering promise to restore order. Alongside his police commissioner, William Bratton, he implemented the broken windows theory, a zero-tolerance strategy that targeted minor offences with the premise that this would prevent greater crimes. Meanwhile, far from City Hall, a collective of young entrepreneurs began to colonize the old industrial lofts of the Flatiron and Soho districts. They saw in the city's empty infrastructure the perfect place to build a new empire. They did not call it Silicon Valley. Its name would be Silicon Alley. The sequence of events unfolded on two simultaneous fronts that fed into each other. On one hand, Giuliani's policies produced a drastic drop in crime rates. Times Square, long a symbol of decay, underwent a corporate cleanup, replacing adult theaters with bright Disney marquees. For many, the city felt safer. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of those same revitalized neighborhoods, the buzzing of modems became the anthem of the new economy. Companies like DoubleClick and Razorfish emerged from nowhere, attracting billions in venture capital. The money that once flowed exclusively to Wall Street now irrigated this new digital ecosystem. The cultural energy did not lag behind. Hip-hop, born in the Bronx, completed its global conquest with figures like the notorious Big and Jay-Z. The impact was seismic. New York not only regained its status as a financial capital, but also established itself as a nerve center for emerging media and technology. The city became magnetic, but this shine had a dark reverse. Gentrification, driven by new technological wealth, accelerated at a dizzying pace. Rents skyrocketed, displacing the artist and immigrant communities that had given the neighborhoods their original character. The very authenticity that attracted innovators was being erased by success. The city was becoming richer and safer, but at what cost to its soul? And here lies the fundamental contradiction of the 90s. Was this era of innovation an organic renaissance, or was it the result of calculated social and economic engineering to create a more profitable and controllable version of New York? The drop in crime was real, but so were the accusations of police brutality and racial profiling. The tech boom created undeniable prosperity, but it also sowed the seeds of even deeper inequality beneath the glow of a reborn Times Square. What essential part of New York was being lost forever? The city, intoxicated by a decade of triumphs and convinced of its own invulnerability, entered the new millennium with its eyes set on a limitless future. No one could imagine that the blue sky of a September morning was about to change its history and that of the world forever. But that era of innovation and apparent invulnerability that had defined New York in the 1990s cast a shadow that no one could see, a shadow that loomed over the threshold of the new millennium, poised to redefine not only the skyline but the very soul of the city. The echo of technological optimism still resonated, but an event of unimaginable magnitude was about to silence everything. The context of the morning of September 11th, 2001 was that of a city at the height of its global power. New York, under the mayorship of Rudy Giuliani, presented itself as a beacon of capitalism and culture. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were the tangible symbol of that hegemony. On the international stage, the administration of President George W. Bush navigated a post-Cold War world where the threats seemed diffuse. However, in the shadows, a network of resentment against United States foreign policy had been crystallizing for years. The key decisions of that day were made in minutes, under inconceivable pressure. The main actors were not kings, but a group of 19 men linked to the terrorist network Al-Qaeda under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, who decided to turn commercial airplanes into guided missiles. In response, the crucial determinations fell upon figures like Mayor Giuliani, whose visible presence at Ground Zero made him the Mayor of America, and upon thousands of firefighters and police officers who chose to run towards danger. Nationally, President Bush's decision to declare a war on terror would shape the course of global politics for decades to come. The sequence of events was seared into the world's consciousness. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. The initial confusion faded 17 minutes later. At 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower in a fireball broadcast live. There was no longer any doubt. It was a coordinated attack. The horror became surreal when, at 9:59, the South Tower collapsed upon itself, and at 10:28, the North Tower followed, crumbling in an apocalyptic cascade of steel and dust that enveloped Lower Manhattan in an artificial night. In less than 2 hours, the most famous skyline in the world had been mutilated, and 2,753 lives in New York had been extinguished. The impact was seismic. The city, which had always prided itself on its frenetic pace, came to a halt. Lower Manhattan became Ground Zero, a smoldering landscape of ruins. The air became toxic, a poisonous legacy that would affect the health of rescuers for years. Psychologically, the sense of security evaporated. The Bush administration pushed the Patriot Act, drastically expanding the government's surveillance powers. In New York, the initial unity coexisted with a dark current of suspicion and an increase in hate crimes against Muslims and people perceived as of Arab descent. The reconstruction of Ground Zero became a national debate, a battleground between memory, real estate interests, and the need to project resilience. From this cataclysm emerges the great question of the chapter: the mystery of resilience and the scar. The New World Trade Center, with its main tower rising defiantly, is a fact of steel and glass. But what does it really represent? Is it a monument to memory or a testament to the relentless march of capital? Could the city truly heal such a deep wound, or did it simply learn to live with its ghost, with the echo of the absent towers that many New Yorkers still see on the horizon? The physical reconstruction is visible, but the reconstruction of the soul of New York remains a complex legacy, a wound that, although closed, forever changed the emotional physiognomy of the metropolis. The reconstruction of Ground Zero became the first major project of the new century. But the shadow of September 11th would not be the only challenge that would define New York in the 21st century. From the ashes of Ground Zero, a new New York struggled to be born, but the scars of September 11th were not the only shadows looming over the new millennium. The trauma had forged a momentary unity. But beneath this surface of solidarity, the ancient tectonic faults of the city began to shift once again. The atmosphere of the early 21st century was marked by a desire for security and a renewed faith in the power of capital to rebuild. It was a time of grand projects and unbridled ambitions, a modern echo of the Gilded Age. In this scenario, the figure of Mayor Michael Bloomberg became central. His administration, which spanned more than a decade, propelled a clear vision to transform New York into a luxury city, a global magnet for talent and wealth. Key decisions emanated from his administration, which promoted an aggressive policy of urban rezoning. Forgotten industrial areas in Brooklyn and Queens and the far west of Manhattan were redrawn on the maps of real estate developers. Companies like Related Companies saw in projects such as Hudson Yards the opportunity to erect a new citadel of steel and glass. The decision was a calculated bet that the future of New York lay in attracting a global elite. The sequence of events was dizzying. Construction cranes became a permanent part of the landscape. Luxury residential towers sprouted from the old docks and factories. This real estate boom, however, cast a long shadow. Land values skyrocketed, and with them, rents. For thousands of working-class and middle-class New Yorkers, the city they had always called home began to feel foreign. Gentrification galloped at an unprecedented pace. Meanwhile, another older adversary began to manifest its power. Climate change was no longer a distant theory. The Bloomberg administration launched Plan YC 2030, an ambitious plan to make New York a more sustainable city. But nature had its own timetable. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy struck the East Coast with devastating fury. The consequences were catastrophic. Ocean water flooded the subway, submerged entire neighborhoods like the Rockaways and the coast of Staten Island, and left much of lower Manhattan in darkness. The storm not only revealed the physical vulnerability of the city, but also brutally exposed the deep social inequality. While the wealthier areas recovered relatively quickly, the poorer communities were left to fend for themselves. Sandy was a violent awakening, a test that the city's infrastructure had deep cracks. The disaster forced the city to rethink its relationship with water and to initiate coastal defense projects. The real question emerging from the floodwaters was not how to rebuild the walls, but how to repair the social fabric. Could a city built on the promise of opportunity for all survive its own transformation into an enclave for a privileged few? The legacy of the 21st century seemed to be a city of two faces, one that shone with unprecedented splendor and another that struggled in the shadows for its own survival. The answer to this question remained suspended in the air. But as the city grappled with water and the growing divide among its citizens, a storm of another kind, one born in the very halls of Wall Street, was silently brewing. A financial collapse of global proportions was about to test the foundations of New York's economy. Among the multiple challenges that defined the new millennium, a storm of a different nature, silent and financial, was brewing in the very heart of Wall Street. Following the post-September 11th reconstruction, New York had entered a phase of feverish optimism. The real estate market, driven by the low interest rates established by the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan, seemed like an engine of infinite prosperity. In investment banks, financial instruments of unprecedented complexity were being designed, collateralized debt obligations or CDOs that packaged and sold mortgages, many of them high risk, known as subprime. It was a financial architecture that promised unlimited profits but was built on fragile foundations. The city, whose budget depended heavily on Wall Street, celebrated the boom without perceiving the abyss. The determinations that would seal the fate of the global economy were made by a handful of men at the peaks of power. At Lehman Brothers, its chief executive officer Richard Fuld had guided the firm toward massive exposure to the real estate market. At Bear Stearns, his counterpart James Kane underestimated the early warning signs. And at the helm of the United States Treasury, Henry Paulson, and at the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, an academic expert on the Great Depression, would face a crisis that would test the limits of their power. These actors, driven by a mix of ambition, ideology, and panic, would make decisions in a matter of days that would echo for decades. The initial tremor was felt in the spring of 2008. Bear Stearns, one of the most venerable investment banks, found itself on the brink of collapse. In a dramatic weekend orchestrated by the Federal Reserve of New York, it was sold at a bargain price to JP Morgan Chase. A giant had been saved, but the intervention revealed the deep illness of the system. The summer passed in a tense calm until September arrived. On the weekend of the 12th, Wall Street leaders were summoned to the Federal Reserve headquarters. The goal? To find a buyer for Lehman Brothers. But this time, the decision of Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson was different. There would be no public bailout. On Monday, the 15th of September 2008, Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. The news fell like an atomic bomb on global markets. The domino effect was instantaneous. The insurance giant AIG found itself on the brink of insolvency in less than 24 hours, forcing the government into a massive bailout of $85 billion. For New York, the impact was catastrophic. The epicenter of the financial earthquake was its very economic heart. Tens of thousands of well-paying jobs evaporated. The hallways of the skyscrapers filled with an unsettling silence. The fall in tax revenues from Wall Street opened a hole of billions of dollars in the city budget, forcing Mayor Michael Bloomberg to announce painful cuts in public services. The urban landscape reflected the crisis. Empty luxury stores, stalled construction projects, and a palpable atmosphere of anxiety. The crisis was not just a statistic, it was a visible reality on the streets. And amid the economic rubble, the great question that still haunts historians emerged. Why was the fall of Lehman Brothers allowed when Bear Stearns had been rescued and AIG would be shortly after? The official line, defended by Henry Paulson, was that the Treasury lacked the legal authority, but many suspect it was a deliberate decision to punish excessive risk-taking. Was it a principled decision? An attempt to impose discipline on the market, or was it a miscalculation with unimaginable consequences? The mystery of that decision remains an open wound in the history of New York, a reminder that in times of crisis, the line between prudence and recklessness becomes dangerously blurred. The city was forced to reinvent itself, and while the titans of finance struggled to rebuild their empires in the streets, theaters, and galleries, another form of recovery, deeper and more human, began to bloom. As the ashes of the 2008 financial crisis still settled over Wall Street, a different kind of capital began to reaffirm its value. It was not measured in stocks, but in canvases, scores, and scripts. In the shadow of the recession, New York faced a profound moral reckoning. The administration of Mayor Michael Bloomberg, aware that reliance on finance was a vulnerability, pushed for a diversification strategy. Tourism and culture were no longer mere complements, but fundamental pillars for reconstruction. The stage was set for a cultural explosion that would redefine New York's global identity. In this new theater of operations, the protagonists were not bankers, but visionaries of a different kind. Figures such as Thomas Campbell, director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or Glenn Lowry at the Museum of Modern Art, took bold initiatives. They understood that in a wounded world, art could be both a refuge and an economic engine. Their decision to schedule high-impact exhibitions, shows that became media events, was a calculated gamble. On Broadway, producers like Cameron Mackintosh and Jeffrey Seller risked fortunes on productions that challenged conventions, and on the streets, anonymous artists like Banksy chose to turn the urban fabric into their personal gallery. The sequence of this golden age of art was dizzying and multifaceted. Broadway witnessed an unprecedented phenomenon. Hamilton *. Lin-Manuel Miranda's work was not just a musical, it was a cultural earthquake. By merging the foundational history of the United States with the language of hip-hop, it attracted a new generation to the theater. Meanwhile, museums became destinations for mass pilgrimage. The 2011 exhibition Alexander McQueen. Savage Beauty at the Met broke all attendance records, demonstrating that the line between haute couture, art and spectacle had dissolved. People did not just go to see art, they went to experience a phenomenon. To be part of a cultural moment and to document it on emerging social media. This was the mystery of the new era. Art was no longer just observed, it was lived and shared digitally. The streets themselves became an ephemeral canvas. Banksy's residency in 2013 transformed the city into a treasure hunt, with each new piece generating media frenzy. The immediate result of this cultural effervescence was profound and paradoxical. On one hand, the cultural and tourism industry became a formidable economic engine, generating billions of dollars. The brand New York was strengthened, consolidating itself as its undisputed creative epicenter. The city felt vibrant, but beneath this brilliant surface a shadow grew. The very cultural success that revitalized the city also accelerated gentrification. Neighborhoods like Bushwick in Brooklyn, which had become havens for artists, saw their authenticity turn into a product. Galleries and studios were replaced by luxury condominiums. The legacy of this era was dual, a celebration of the power of art to heal, and at the same time the painful realization that creativity, once commodified, can devour its own creators. And so, we are left with the central question about New York's cultural identity in the 21st century. In its quest for survival and global relevance, has the city perfected the art of creativity, or has it created a flawlessly packaged version of itself for mass consumption? The mystery is no longer where art comes from, but what remains of its soul when its value is measured in clicks and tickets sold. This new cultural ecosystem, increasingly dependent on the digital, was the harbinger of an even deeper transformation. As the echo of applause resonated in the theaters of Broadway, a distinct form of creativity, quieter yet equally transformative, began to weave its own network into the fabric of the city. The previous chapter left us at the cultural epicenter of the world. But beneath the surface, a new code was being written. A code that promised to redefine the power and identity of New York in the 21st century. The context at the beginning of the new millennium was one of caution. The ashes of the World Trade Center were a palpable reminder, and the financial crisis of 2008 had left a deep scar, revealing the dangerous dependence on Wall Street. In the shadow of these traumas, a fundamental question arose: could New York reinvent itself once more? The answer lay in a riddle: how to transform the dense urban landscape into fertile ground for software engineers. The ghost of the dot-com bubble burst at the end of the 90s still lingered. Would this attempt be different? This is where key characters and actions come into play. The administration of Mayor Michael Bloomberg, himself a magnate of financial technology, became the principal architect of this transformation. Bloomberg and his team did not see technology as just another industry, but as the future nervous system of the metropolis. Their boldest decision was the competition to build a world-class applied sciences campus. In 2011, they announced a monumental plan to grant public land on Roosevelt Island and offer an investment of $100 million. Cornell University and the Technion of Israel won the competition. promising to create Cornell Tech, a catalyst designed to generate thousands of jobs. Simultaneously, venture capital figures like Fred Wilson of Union Square Ventures challenged the orthodoxy of Silicon Valley, arguing that New York's talent density offered a unique advantage. Their investments in startups like Etsy and Tumblr were acts of faith in a new New York paradigm. The sequence of events was a chain reaction. As the Bloomberg administration implemented technology-friendly policies, the ecosystem began to flourish. The old lofts of the Flatiron District and Chelsea filled with programmers. Unlike the suburban campuses of California, New York's tech scene was intrinsically urban. Startups did not emerge from garages, but from co-working spaces. This proximity fostered a unique cross-pollination. The sophistication of fashion merged with e-commerce. The speed of news propelled media technology, and the complexity of Wall Street gave birth to a new wave of financial technology. Tech giants like Google massively expanded their presence, transforming an old Port Authority building in Chelsea into one of their largest engineering campuses. Facebook and Amazon followed suit. The result was seismic. The city's economy, previously dangerously tilted towards finance, found a new and robust pillar. Between 2010 and 2020, New York's tech sector grew at a pace that far outstripped the rest of the local economy. Entire neighborhoods transformed. The image of New York mutated. It was no longer just the home of the Wolf of Wall Street, but also of the tech unicorn. The city had solved the riddle of economic diversification, or at least it seemed that way. But every great historical transformation leaves behind its own mystery. The meteoric rise of the tech sector generated unprecedented wealth. However, this new digital shine cast an increasingly long shadow. The influx of 6- and 7-figure salaries created unsustainable pressure on an already expensive city, accelerating gentrification and widening the social gap. The unsettling paradox is, how did an industry built on the promise of connecting the world contribute to creating one of the most unequal cities in the nation? In its race to build a smarter tomorrow, had the city forgotten the algorithm of social equity? The brilliance of technological innovation cast a long shadow over the real estate market and the sustainable fabric of the city, presenting a set of complex challenges. This technological renaissance, this new golden age forged in silicon, cast a long and complex shadow over the very fabric of the city. The echo of success resonated on Wall Street and Silicon Alley. But in the streets, a murmur of unease began to grow, fueled by two ancestral forces, space and survival. The metropolis now faced an existential mystery. Could a city consume itself? The context of this new challenge was shaped in the decade following the financial crisis of 2008. As the city recovered with surprising strength, the urban policies implemented under Michael Bloomberg and continued by Bill de Blasio laid the groundwork for a paradox. On one hand, unprecedented growth was promoted. On the other, inequality, that old wound of the Gilded Age, reopened. Key decisions were no longer made by magnates, but by a new pantheon of actors: real estate giants, anonymous investment funds, and a municipal administration caught between the need for tax revenue and the pressure from its citizens. The decision of the de Blasio administration to implement mandatory inclusionary housing in 2016 was one of those crucial moves, an attempt to force developers to include affordable units. But was it a true antidote or merely a palliative? The sequence of events manifested in the very skyline of the city. While attention focused on the World Trade Center, another transformation was underway. In the heart of Manhattan, along the southern edge of Central Park, a jungle of glass began to rise, the so-called Billionaire's Row, incredibly slender and tall towers designed for an ultra-wealthy and often absent clientele. These buildings became the most visible symbol of the crisis. They were monuments to inequality, sky-high safes casting literal shadows over neighborhoods, while at ground level, housing prices soared. Families who had lived for generations in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side found themselves displaced. Community boards in Brooklyn and the Bronx became battlegrounds. The number of homeless individuals reached figures not seen since the Great Depression. Simultaneously, another challenge, quieter yet equally existential, emerged from the waters. The memory of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 acted as a portent. Sustainability ceased to be an abstract concept and became a matter of survival. The municipal administration launched ambitious plans like One NYC aimed at achieving carbon neutrality and strengthening defenses against rising sea levels. Laws such as the Climate Mobilization Act were passed, requiring large buildings to drastically reduce their emissions. But each step forward revealed the magnitude of the challenge. How to modernize a century-old subway system, how to protect 800 kilometers of vulnerable coastline. The result was a city in a state of permanent tension. On one hand, the vibrant energy of innovation. On the other, the constant anxiety of a population struggling to maintain its place. The social fabric, which had historically been strengthened with each new wave of immigrants, now seemed to be fraying. And here lies the central question of our time, the soul of the metropolis. Over 400 years, New York has mutated, burned, and risen again. But now the question is more fundamental. For whom is New York? Is it the beacon of hope immortalized in the Statue of Liberty? Or has its success become its own curse, transforming it into a global luxury product? The legacy of generations faces the anonymous force of transnational capital. This is the mystery that is written every day in rental contracts, in the decisions of urban planners, and in the broken and fulfilled dreams of its 8 million inhabitants. This is the enigma that hangs over present-day New York, a question whose answer is not found in the past, but in visions for its future. We have traversed the scars and triumphs of New York, from the trails of the Lenape to the shadows cast by the skyscrapers of the 21st century. In our previous chapter, we peered into the abyss of its current challenges, a housing crisis and the imminent spectre of climate change. This is the context of our final chapter, a city at the pinnacle, aware that its survival depends not on its past, but on its ability to envision a radically different future. The echoes of past crises resonate as a warning. History has shown that New York either reinvents itself or perishes, and now the reinvention must be the most ambitious of its existence. The key figures in this final act are neither magnates nor generals. They are a coalition of urban planners, scientists, activists, and municipal administrations. Figures like those who make up the Department of Urban Planning, armed with data, are charting the lines of a new map. Their decisions, contained in reports and master plans, are the scrolls of tomorrow. They face a historic dilemma: how to protect the city without displacing the communities that give it life. Each rezoning proposal, each new regulation is a crucial determination that carries the weight of 400 years of history. Large real estate development corporations also play their part, seeing in the crisis an opportunity to build a new legacy, often in tension with the vision of public planners. The sequence of these events is already underway, unfolding in a multifaceted plan. The most visible of these efforts is the Coastal Resilience Project, sometimes referred to as the Great U. It is not a simple wall, but a riddle of modern engineering, a series of berms, deployable parks, and barriers integrated into the urban landscape designed to embrace and repel water. From the Lower East Side to Battery Park, defenses are being erected that aspire to be invisible. At the same time, in the depths of Brooklyn and Queens, another battle is being fought. The administration is pushing for massive rezonings in industrial neighborhoods like Gowanus, seeking to transform contaminated land into vibrant communities. The plan is to create tens of thousands of new homes, a portion of which will be affordable. It echoes the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, a new imposition of order over chaos, but this time with sustainability as the guiding principle. Green roofs and designs that prioritize pedestrians over automobiles are being promoted. The immediate impact of these visions is already being felt, creating new tensions. The construction of coastal barriers has begun to alter access to the East River, generating protests from residents who fear losing their connection to the water. In neighborhoods subject to rezoning, The ghost of gentrification casts a long shadow. Land prices are skyrocketing, and small businesses and lifelong residents wonder if there will be a place for them. Coalitions of neighbours are forming to fight for more equitable development. Reviving the activist spirit that saved neighbourhoods like Greenwich Village decades ago, the city becomes a living laboratory where each new building is an experiment with direct human consequences. And here, at the end of our long journey, we face the ultimate question. We have seen New York, born from commerce, grow through immigration, define itself by its ambition, and survive catastrophes. Now it attempts a final transformation to shift from being a consumption engine to a model of sustainability. Can these plans, as brilliant as they may be, truly change the soul of a metropolis built on perpetual growth? Or are they simply the last layer of varnish over an unalterable structure, a futile attempt to tame a force that has always consumed and rebuilt relentlessly? The mystery is no longer what secrets lie beneath its streets, but whether the city can forge a future that does not betray the essence of its tumultuous and glorious past. And so, the final chapter closes. The legacy of New York is not etched in stone, but in the incessant flow of its own reinvention. A perpetual enigma, a city that is not a place, but a constant state of becoming, whose true map is always yet to be drawn.